A year on from the overthrow of Egypt's first democratically elected leader, anti-coup supporters remain defiant in the face of mass trials, imprisonment and death sentences. But can Egypt's army chief turned president implement his roadmap for reform? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. The first anniversary of the military overthrow of Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi has been marked with calls for a day of anger by his supporters. It's also serving as a test of strength for the anti-coup alliance and Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood, which has been declared a terrorist organization by the new government in December. The man who now holds the post of president, former General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, was hailed as a savior by many Egyptians for deposing Morsi. But it's been a turbulent 12 months since then. More than 1,400 people have been killed, thousands jailed, and hundreds sentenced to death, challenging Sisi's vision of a transition to a democracy. Well, to our discussion in a moment after we hear from Al Jazeera's Hashim Ahelbara.
Denouncing a coup that took place a year ago. These are supporters of deposed President Mohamed Morsi. They want the man to be returned to office. Morsi was ousted by this man, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, on July the 3rd, 2013. A year later, Egyptians remain bitterly divided.
We don't see any change. We haven't seen any change in the past 30 years or the past 35 years. Neither will we see any change in the next 100 years.
Egypt needs a military man to fix things. It won't do having a normal person rule the country. If you look now, there's control over Tahrir now since Sisi has become president.
Despite tight security and a wave of clampdowns on Muslim Brotherhood supporters, they remain defiant. Human rights agencies are alarmed about what they describe as a deteriorating humanitarian situation. This is what Amnesty International had to say.
A surge in arbitrary arrests, detentions and harrowing incidents of torture and deaths in police custody recorded by Amnesty International provides strong evidence of the sharp deterioration in human rights in Egypt in the years since President Mohamed Morsi was ousted. July
the 3rd. A day many Egyptians will remember for generations. The defense minister, surrounded by secular, leftist and religious leaders, makes what many people consider a stunning declaration.
This roadmap includes suspending the constitution, holding early presidential and parliamentary elections, and the formation of a national reconciliation committee that will include young people.
After Morsi was deposed, his supporters set up protest camps and promised to stay for as long as it took for that leader to be reinstated. Egyptian security forces stormed those camps. Hundreds of people were killed, according to human rights organizations, and attacks targeting security forces were on the rise. Leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood were put in jail. Some now face death sentences. Seen by many of his supporters as a savior, Sisi was elected president in June. Sisi has rejected calls for reconciliation with the banned Muslim Brotherhood, and that has only raised concerns about more clampdowns on dissent in Egypt. Hashim Ahelbara, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's bring in our guests. Here with me in the studio is Zakaria Abdul Hadi, Associate Professor of Islamic Thought and Culture at Qatar University. Joining us on Skype from Cairo is Sharif Abdul Quddus, an independent journalist and correspondent for Democracy Now! And in Beirut, we have Angus Blair, president of the Syniat Institute, a think tank. Welcome to you all. But before we start, I just want to run through a little more of what President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi said after his inauguration ceremony last month. He said, "I vowed to protect the republican system which was founded by the Great Revolution of July. establish justice and equality, protect the dignity of the Egyptian citizen, and respect the new constitution as a constitution of a civilian country and civilian rule. So lots to talk about, and let's begin in Cairo with Sharif Abdul Quddus. There have been sporadic and very intense demonstrations throughout the day. Clearly, resistance to the Sisi government continues.
That's right. There's been at least reports of at least 2 dead today in clashes in Cairo, and a number of bombs went off also today and earlier in the week. The protests have continued on the streets. Activists have spoken out, but this has come in the face of a massive crackdown on any and all opposition voices. The independent research group Wiki Thawra says that over 40,000 people are in prison, the vast majority of them for political reasons. Over 50 people have died in custody, according to the same group. There's been excessive use of force by security forces, with protesters killed on the streets. Of course, including the worst incident of mass killings in Egypt's modern history on August 14th, with the forcible dispersal of the pro-Morsi sit-ins. The prosecution has not even opened up an investigation into that. We have reports of secret prisons, of torture, of arbitrary arrest, and extensive restrictions on that have been imposed on freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. And this crackdown has extended way beyond the Muslim Brotherhood and its supporters to all opposition voices, including activists that first launched and sustained the revolution, people like Ali Abdel Fattah, his younger sister as well, Sana, is in prison. People like Mahinur al-Masri in Alexandria is in prison. The founders of the April 6 youth movement, and thousands of other mainly young people whose names are not known, who languish in prisons, many of them detained without charge. And many of them are being sentenced under a very draconian protest law that effectively bans protests in Egypt, and receiving years in prison. And as you mentioned, of course, we have this verdict against 3 Al Jazeera journalists being sentenced to between 7 and 10 years in prison, others receiving 10 years in absentia. And I think what's important to realize is that the judiciary in Egypt now has become a willing partner in this repression.
Well, we'll discuss, if we may, the judiciary and certain aspects of what you're mentioning there in a moment, but I want to bring in Zakaria Abdul Hadi at this particular point. We've heard the catalogue of what has happened over the past year, and yet there is still apparent resistance to the Sisi government in the streets.
Yeah, that's true. I totally agree with your guest in Cairo, and this is something that people have been hoping for over the last 30 years. They have been hoping that they will breathe some fresh air of freedom and justice, and they have not been given that over the last 3 years since the 25th of January revolution. That was their main aim, that they want some freedom, and what they get in return, they get imprisonment, they get shot in the street. Anybody who open his mouth, even those who were supporting the coup from the beginning, as you just said, they are now put in prison. So it is a very chaotic situation. The economy have deteriorated more, more people are getting more poorer, so there is no, all the promises that Sisi was claiming that he will come. He said that he's coming to stop the massacre of people and killing of people and 2 factions and so on. And what we have realized is that there are thousands of people have been killed, and over 40,000 have been imprisoned. People are being sentenced, and now lately we have been hearing reports very disturbing about girls being raped in prisons. And this is something really disturbing, because this is something that have never been in Arab countries before, that you find somebody raping a girl just for her political opinions. This is something very disturbing.
We'll look at an Amnesty report which has just been released at a moment. But Angus Blair, first off to you, from our first 2 guests, certainly a deeply dismal report card for Sisi's first year in office. Do you concur?
Well, it comes after a previous year of incompetence as well, quite frankly, and human rights abuses under the Morsi administration. You have to put it in context. Egypt's been in a revolution since the beginning of 2011. And that revolution will continue in a variety of shapes and substance for a long time. And you have to also put it in context that in a country where there are institutions, the people who are in charge don't like instability, because quite frankly, it's very difficult to plan, to make any form of formal governance, to be able to plan for the future. So you find that there's an overreaction on the other side, of which we've seen over the last few years in trying to control protest movements and so on. So I wouldn't just restrict to, criticism over the last year, because quite frankly, when you saw under Morsi the centre of Christianity under attack in his period of office, and it's one reason why the Orthodox Church, the Coptic Church, went against the Morsi administration, was in favour of the army taking charge last summer, because there was such a big wave of resistance after that year of incompetence. I think I have to say the narrative which we're discussing, just looking, obviously you have to look at what's happened over the last year, but it's a series of events over the last few years, and to look at it without the longer term context I think might be a bit misleading, because clearly there are abuses in Egypt, some incredible heavy-handedness and bullying on behalf of the state, not the least of which was actually pointed out by the British centred International Bar Association report, Human Rights Institute report within the IBA in the last few years, pointing out issues to do with judiciary and sentencing and so on. There are very significant problems in Egypt, not the least of which are economic. The fact that people want to get back to work. But it isn't just economic, it's an issue of justice, of people feeling a part of society and ownership of society, a stakeholder in society and in the future. And that's why you have, I think, very, very much knee-jerk reactions from institutions of state, and then the criticism you've had from Amnesty and elsewhere. But I would suggest that you've got to look at it in a wider context of a time series of events, all of which actually, I think, the majority of which do not work in favour of a more stable Egypt in terms of economics and politics, because in the end, the elephant in the room is the population, and the population aren't being involved in this discussion and having an agenda and having a plan for Egypt's future.
Well, let me put that to Zakaria Abdul Hadi here, the argument that one cannot look at the past year in isolation, that it is a consequence of a period of what critics would say is mismanagement by Morsi and his political movement. Do you think that is the context to look at it in, to see what is happening today as a consequence of a longer process, not just the past year of Sisi rule?
I think you need to look at what the people from the coup government are saying themselves. I mean, the coup government, we have the interior minister who was saying that during the regime of Morsi, we have not been supporting him. Whatever he was ordering us to do, we are not been following him. And this was not the case only with the interior minister. That was the case with all the bodies of the government. Nobody was helping Morsi. That was the message that they want to try to say. The first elected president. The issue is not Morsi. I'm not here defending Morsi as a president. I respect him as a professor, an intellectual person, but this is not the issue of Morsi. It is the issue of the first time we have an elected president. They don't want this to happen, because if people get used to have an elected president by their own vote, they feel that when they throw the ballot paper with the name, it will come that they have elected that individual. The deep state, they don't want this to happen, and that's what they have been working over the year with Morsi to make him a failure. All the government bodies, they were working against him. In fact, the things that, for example, the removal of the bad and the Bru Mubarak regime, when he was trying to remove them, that was shown as something bad and so on. So you'll find that with their own tongues, the people who are working in the current government now, they think that they have not been working and helping Morsi to make him a failure so that they can get rid of him. But as I said, it is not about Morsi, it's about democracy. Egypt are going to face a huge problem with democracy if we're not going to go back to the idea of the ballot box.
Well, let me go to Sharif Abdul Quddus on that particular point. I mean, to what extent has the whole concept of democracy been undercut? Whatever one thought of the Morsi government, he was voted in through the ballot box. Is there among the Egyptian people a concern, a panic, if you want, about the process of democracy itself, which has been undercut by Morsi's removal, some would argue?
It's very important to remember that democracy is much more than the ballot box. I do agree with what Angus said earlier, in that, you know, when despite the Muslim Brotherhood being amongst the biggest victims of this crackdown, they shoulder much of the responsibility for where we are today politically. They formed a coalition of convenience with the army in 2011 to hold revolutionary aspirations in check and mass mobilizations in check. They backed a very flawed transition plan because it proved an easy way and a quick way to achieve power. They wanted a brutal security sector, and they encouraged crackdowns by the police on anti-Morsi protesters. When people were being rounded up and jailed and tortured, and when 60 civilians were gunned down in Port Said, Mohamed Morsi went on national television and thanked the police for their efforts. They also tried to restrict freedom of association with a very draconian NGO law. They cracked down on the media. So I think we have to be very clear I think the Muslim Brotherhood, while they did win successive elections, they rather than try and reform or change the state, they really tried to co-opt it and become a new elite in the post-Mubarak landscape. And for that reason, and for their very majoritarian view of democracy, where they won 50+1 in the presidential election, and then sought no kind of consultation with civil society on state policy, alienated all political opposition forces completely, that when the army and the police turned on the Muslim Brotherhood, they were left standing completely alone. And now they're amongst the biggest victims of this crackdown. We have the interior minister who's leading this crackdown was appointed by Morsi himself in January of 2013. So we have to put these things in perspective. Of course, where we are today is very damaging in terms of can we have effective elections going forward? We have a parliamentary election coming up with a parliamentary law that seems to will give a lot of power to individual power brokers, the remnants of the National Democratic Party, as opposed to political parties that are still trying to be formed. So this is where we're at today.
Well, let's go to Angus Blair. And Angus, your response firstly to Zakaria Abdul Hadi's comment about the fact that it's not about Morsi, it's about the process of democracy itself. Whether or not one accepts the argument about the failures of that Morsi government, the issue is not about him, it's about the concept of democracy and the ballot box. Your response?
Well, if you look over the last year, there has been a vote on a new constitution. There has been an election for a new president, and the president that was voted on by the people, is Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. He is the new president. Whether people in Egypt or outside like it, that's what has happened. He is the president of Egypt. In terms of Morsi, I would back Mr. Abdel Qaddus's points, but also make some more. The fact that Mohamed Morsi didn't need any outside force to prove that he was incompetent. The Muslim Brotherhood proved when they were in charge that they were not a democratic body. They were not in favor of making real democratic change. Following on from Mr. Abdel Qaddus's points, they damaged the process. They damaged Egypt in that process, and they had a wider issue beyond Egypt. And that's why, in the end, when you call it a coup, it is wider than that. We have to think of a new term of what happened in Egypt. It was a whole mix of things that happened a year ago. There was an enormous body of the public that was in favour of change, and you can't ignore that. And I think if you just look at it purely in terms of one issue alone, it's not right, because again, some people may have taken advantage and have taken advantage of what's happened over the last year, but in the end, the people will decide what will happen. Well, and if Egypt continues to have low economic growth of below 2%, very high inflation amongst the highest in the world, low job creation, issues to do with the overall management of the economy in terms of foreign exchange reserves, but particularly in terms of government, and the fact that it's got an enormous budget deficit, one of the highest in the world, there are enormous strains. In the end, if the current government, and I would not call it a coup government because there are incredibly competent people in this government who I know are fully committed to doing their very best to help Egypt. There are enormous structural issues at play in Egypt beyond the body politic that really need to be sorted out. As I mentioned, these economic issues. And under the guidance of President al-Sisi, he really has got to put together a plan, which I have not seen, which no one has seen yet. I think so far they're firefighting all the various issues about Egypt rather than just raising taxes. They should be cutting them. A whole variety of issues to help the population.
If I may get to Zakaria Abdul Hadi on this particular point, the idea of Sisi has made many promises.
Yeah.
He has assured the people that he will get Egypt on the right path. Can he do it without a wide popular support than perhaps some would argue he enjoys at the moment?
I don't, first, let me just point it out that it is what we have witnessed so far over the past year is a total failure. Sisi have been running the show from day one after the coup, and he have actually not from the 3rd of July last year. He have been running it before. He was preparing for that coup. This is a coup, whether you like it or not, it's a coup. You can, if I were to make a coup and then I said, okay, well, let's make some kind of election so that it will bring me in power, and then I'll win with 79%.
But we are dealing with the reality, as Angus Blair said. He has been appointed president through the ballot box, and that is the situation at the moment.
How many people who came and voted? You will have to look at, again, the numbers and figures, how many people came and voted, and how many abstained, and how many were in prisons, and how many were killed, and all these things. So it is not a fair thing to say that. The other point is that let us point out, I just need one example of something successful that Sisi and his government have done since the beginning of since he took power until now. It's a total failure. They said that the economy will be better. It's more debt. They said that security will be better. More people are getting killed in the street. More bombs are coming. More incredible movement that we never heard of, Beit al-Maqdis or something called groups that you never heard of, just appearing, and they claiming that they are making bombs which they don't exist, and then Muslim Brotherhood have been blamed from it, and then other Ala al-Fattah and other people are getting imprisoned for it. It's crazy.
Well, let's, throughout this chaos, let's just go to Sharif Abdul Quddus very quickly here. And is there an answer to that question? Are things potentially going to be better or not?
It's very hard to predict, but the trajectory does not bode well. In terms of both human rights, the Sisi regime seems to be opting for a blunt repression as a way to deal with any political opposition. And in terms of economics, we still don't know. The Sisi government, Sisi signed a budget yesterday. There was no transparency whatsoever around the budget. We don't really know the details of the budget yet. Egypt is suffering from severe electricity shortages. There's very frequent power cuts now in the hot summer, happens several times a day. He's planning to put forward austerity measures with a plan to cut energy subsidies, which take up a whopping 20% of the government budget. Fuel prices will go up, and the planning minister just told Reuters that he expects a spike in inflation to send it into the double digits. So we'll have to see. But what we do know is that the government is being heavily supported by its allies in the Gulf, primarily Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And the army is managing much of this incoming financial support. Just one project is a $40 billion contract to the Dubai construction firm to build low-income housing. So the army is getting much more involved directly into managing the economy and managing these big contracts to try and give it a jump start.
Well, very much a wait and see. At that particular point, my thanks to our guests, Sharif Abdul Quddus in Cairo, Angus Blair in Beirut, and Zakaria Abdul Hadi here in Doha. And before we go, a word about the 3 Al Jazeera journalists jailed in Egypt who've now been in prison since December the 29th. Last week, Peter Grester and Mohammed Fahmy were sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. Baher Mohammed was given 10 years for possessing a spent bullet which he'd picked up at a protest. Al Jazeera rejects the charges against them and continues to demand their release. I'm Mike Hanna, thanks for watching, and we're going to leave the last word to Peter Grester's mother after his parents saw him in jail for the first time.
Well, for us, it was the most difficult day of our life. It was very emotional, and Peter was quite sombre. I mean, I think the reality is starting to sink in now, and I found it hard. You know, it's not an easy thing to do, to go into that Torah prison jail. The conditions are very harsh and stark, and very, very dusty, and it was not easy. That's all I can say.